It's pretty normal for families to disagree on things, right? Everyone has different opinions on everything. Blood ties us together, but it sure doesn't make us think the same as our relatives. For the most part, when our families get into arguments, they can move on from it fairly quickly, but some people are better at holding grudges than others. Some people dwell on the ugly parts of family life and hold grudges so strongly that it drives them to do the unthinkable. Today, we're looking at some of the most notorious cases of a family homicide in history, and how it took almost 10 years to convict a controversial suspect. This is the case of the Lin family murders. In 2009, life seemed pretty normal for the Lin family, who lived in North Epping, New South Wales. Min Lin and his wife Yun Lee ran a successful news agency, and the couple was known in their community as Norman and Lily. They had 3 children, their oldest daughter Brenda, and their 2 boys, Henry and Terry. They all lived close to Lily's sister Irene, as well as Norma's sister Kathy and her husband Robert Xie. The family spent a lot of time together, and from the outside looking in, it seemed like they all loved each other and got along well. But everything changed on July 18th, 2009. That morning, Kathy started receiving confusing phone calls from customers who regularly visited the news agency run by her brother and sister-in-law. They called because the news agency hadn't opened that morning, which was super unusual because Norman and Lily took a lot of pride in their business and always made sure to open on time. Kathy couldn't think of a reason why the store wouldn't be open on that day. If there had been an emergency, surely Norman or Lily would have called her, right? Unable to get a hold of the pair, Kathy and Robert decided to drive over to their house to see what was up. When they got there, they found that the front door had been left open and knew straight away something wasn't right. The house was totally silent, so Kathy decided to investigate upstairs. What she found was horrifying. In the main bedroom, she found the body of Lily, completely drenched in blood. She'd been beaten so badly that she was almost unrecognizable. In another room, they found Irene, who had suffered the same fate. And worst of all, the same cruel act had been inflicted on Henry and Terry. After discovering the whole family was gone, Kathy called for emergency services and told them, "I need someone to come quick because I think someone killed my brother's family." In the call, you can hear Kathy begging Robert to stay with her at the scene until the police arrived, but he insisted on leaving so he could drive to pick up his parents-in-law and give them the bad news. When the police arrived, they said that the crime scene was totally horrendous. Each of the family members looked as though they'd had their skulls beaten to a pulp in their beds as they slept, aside from Norman, who was found in the same condition, but his body was hidden by a duvet. There was blood all over the walls, ceiling, and floor, and they could tell that the killings were carried out with an object similar to a hammer. The coroner determined that Henry and Terry had put up a fight against their killer and showed numerous signs of self-defense. It's thought that their parents were killed first, the boys second, and Irene was the last to die. The police soon uncovered an interesting detail. The electricity to the house had been deliberately cut off. This meant the crime probably took place in total darkness, and the killer would need to have an understanding of the layout of the house to carry out the crime. Also, this would have made it impossible for anyone in the house to call for help using the landline phone. It was discovered that the door had been unlocked with a key, and there were no signs of a break-in, another indicator that the killer was someone known to the family and possibly had a key to the house. One of their most promising pieces of evidence was the 24 blood-soaked shoe prints found on the carpet upstairs. The prints belonged to a pair of men's Asics sneakers. Their size, between 8.5 to 10.5. This gave police a pretty good idea of what kind of person they should be investigating. Someone similar with the home, probably male given the type of shoes they wore, as well as the amount of force they used, and the theory that this was personal. The nature of the crime scene indicated to the police at first that this could have been a burglary gone wrong. However, there was nothing missing from the home aside from the evidence of the killings. The house was untouched. Whoever did this had a personal score they wanted to settle with the Lin family. A few days earlier, Norman had taken his daughter Brenda to school, a little earlier than usual. She was heading off on a school trip abroad to New Caledonia. Years later, she'd tell reporters that the last time she saw her father, she refused to hug or even say goodbye to him because she was embarrassed to do so in front of her friends. She was sure she would see him again in a few weeks, and not saying goodbye to him is her biggest regret. Brenda was the last to find out that her family were all dead, and before any of her relatives could reach her, she discovered the news through a Facebook article. She returned to Australia immediately and wasn't able to fully accept what happened until she saw her aunt and uncle waiting for her at the airport. As soon as I saw my aunt, she gave me this massive hug. She was crying as well, and I think that's when I knew it was real. Brenda went to live with Kathy and Robert as the investigation continued. What no one knew was that she was already under the same roof as the prime suspect. The police started looking into Robert when they realized their connections between him, his behavior, and the case. One reason was his behavior on the day he and his wife discovered the crime scene. Why would you leave your wife alone in a house where a whole family was just murdered? What if the culprit was still at the scene? It's also believed that Robert may have used this time as an opportunity to get rid of the murder weapon. The second reason was the shoe prints. As I mentioned, they knew that the shoes were from the brand and the shape and the pattern of the sole narrowed down to 6 models of Asics sneakers, including the Asics Gel Elevation 2. Can you guess who owned a pair of these exact shoes? That's right, Robert did, in a size 9.5. Right in the middle of the range of suspected shoe sizes worn by the culprit. Lastly, they believed Robert had at least one motive for slaying the family. Before he moved to Melbourne in 2006, Robert worked as an ear, nose, and throat specialist in China. After he arrived in Australia with Kathy, they opened a restaurant in Melbourne, but the business failed and they moved to Sydney to be closer to Kathy's family. Robert had been unemployed ever since, and this was mentioned a lot by Kathy's family. His parents-in-law often compared him to Norman, who was very successful and made him feel subordinate. One witness said that Robert told them that the family made him lose face, which is very significant in Chinese culture and could have made him deeply resent the Lins. Probably the most disturbing motive of all was Brenda. Before her family even died, she'd complained that Robert acted inappropriately towards her, but no charges had ever been brought to him. It was suggested that he killed the Lins so that Brenda would be forced to live with him and he could continue to disrupt her life, which he did, even when she was living with him and his wife. Only someone who knew the family would know that Brenda would conveniently be out of the country when the crime took place. The police claimed that on several occasions they saw evidence that Robert behaved strangely towards Brenda, and later in life, she went into detail about what he did to her before and during her time living with him and Kathy. Sadly, he was never prosecuted for these crimes against Brenda. In May 2011, Robert was arrested for all 5 deaths, and this marked the beginning of a long, messy road to justice. Robert applied for bail multiple times after he was arrested, and it was eventually granted in December 2012. However, after an appeal, he was once again refused bail and was forced to stay in jail until his trial. At first, he pleaded not guilty to the crimes. By this point, Kathy's parents and Brenda totally believed he was guilty and turned against Robert, who still had the support of his wife. He was scheduled to stand trial in 2013, but they had to reschedule for the following year due to new evidence, which was during the time that Brenda first came forward about her experiences with Robert. Another key piece of evidence in this case was known as Stain 91. Police heard that the morning after the Lins died, Robert thoroughly cleaned out his garage, and this made him suspicious. They conducted a search of the garage and found what looked to be a blood stain on the floor. And when a sample was sent away for testing, it was found the blood stain contained DNA from all 5 members of the Lin family. They determined the stain likely came from the murder weapon or Robert's clothes, which would have been totally soaked in blood. They also discovered some alarming CCTV footage of Robert that showed him destroying a shoebox and flushing the pieces down the toilet. The shoebox belonged to his Asics Gel Elevation 2s. Kathy refused to believe that her husband was guilty and stood firmly by him through each of his 4 trials. She provided police with an alibi and claims that Robert was asleep next to her all night. Investigators said it was possible that Robert sedated Kathy so she wouldn't wake as he came and went from the house in the early hours of that morning. Robert's second trial had to be abandoned after the judge became extremely ill and could no longer perform their duties. The third trial was declared a mistrial after the jury was unable to come to a decision. Robert's lawyers argued that killing 5 people was more than one person was capable of, and the stain in the garage could have been caused at another time. Following this, Robert was granted bail until the beginning of the retrial. His final trial began in June 2016. He hired new barristers, and the court provided new prosecution in order to give the case a clean start. This time, the judge advised the jury that they would accept a majority vote of at least 11-1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1 Robert was sentenced to 5 life sentences in 2017, 8 years after he committed an awful crime. His wife, Kathy, continues to stand by him, and they both insist that Robert is innocent. Brenda, now in her 20s, has struggled to move on with her life. In interviews, she expressed that she would give absolutely anything to have her family back. She hasn't been able to fully enjoy milestones in her life, such as graduating from high school or getting her driver's license, because she can't celebrate with her own family. This is definitely one of the saddest and most awful cases I've covered on this channel. I truly hope that one day Brenda can find joy in her life. I can only imagine what she's had to go through. What do you guys think of this case? Let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section below.